You are listening to the Break Time Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. This week was one where I'd intended to play with some new things, and I ended up in yak shaving land with some tasks to fix things. However, I did throw a little bit of learning in and have been tossing around some ideas in preparation for topics and content for next year. Without further ado, let me share the details. The first one is that I had mentioned a while ago that I released a Graph Academy Spring Data Neo4j course. And I released that and then ended up getting some feedback from internal folks, which was great. And so I went back and tried to incorporate that and update the course so that it has the latest and greatest info in it. I went back to do that, and the issues that I ran up against is, first of all, I have the official repository in a Neo4j organization. And then I have a personal fork of that repository with all the course data and lesson plans and all that kind of stuff. And I wanted to create a feature branch. So I just created a feature branch on my personal fork, did my changes, pushed the feature branch, but then my main branch on my personal fork was behind. So the commit log was huge when I created the pull request to the official repository with that new feature branch. What I ended up doing was going back to my terminal window and rebasing what I had. So I created a new branch of my changes and then rebased with the main branch from the upstream official repository and tried to incorporate what the official repository had, and then hope that I could kind of sync the changes and pick and choose which commits and changes to incorporate from the main rebase and then from my new changes. But it was so behind that I ended up with several iterations of conflict syncing. So a lot of merge conflicts I had to go back and fix. And there were like 18 iterations of that, which was huge. I ended up finally, after doing all of that, I spent quite a bit of the afternoon working on that this week on one day. And I ended up with an end result that somehow still differed from the remote main branch in several different ways that it shouldn't have. So several things that were way outdated that I'd updated several months ago now were showing back up in the repository and it hadn't synced correctly. So I ended up reaching out to a couple of colleagues. They recommended I try a git diff and then apply the diff to a new branch that was synced from main. And that the diff application ended up erroring out and I couldn't even apply it. What I ended up kind of resorting to is like, okay, is there any way that I can just start fresh, resync, a hard resync with whatever's in the official repository in the remote main branch, and then just cherry pick my commits on top of that? And so that seemed to work. And I've got a couple of articles and blog posts that I came across to help me work through this. I'll try to link them all in the show notes, but there's a few. I'll mention a couple of things that I really found helpful with each one of these articles that made this process a little bit simpler without making it feel like I was going on further down the rabbit hole in the Git black hole of stuff and issues. The first one is I needed to reset my local branch to the remote official branch. What I ended up doing was a git reset --hard, then the remote, which was upstream, named upstream for me, and then the branch, which was main. So I did that. It reset my local with anything that was in the remote official repository. Now, the downside of this is it's going to overwrite what you have. So you can save back any changes you have or any fixes you might have done locally. You can save those back into another branch. But as I said, I knew I had the changes that I made in a couple of commits that were in a local feature branch on my repository in my fork. And so I didn't have to worry about saving anything local. I just wanted to reset everything local and then just pull a couple of things that I had saved in my remote fork. Anyway, I did that. The thing that I really liked about this blog post is it gave this command and then it also gave a git clean -xdf, which cleaned up any untracked files, folders, ignored files, and so on that were in the repository, which was kind of nice. I knew I had a completely clean slate. I'd cleaned up anything that might have been hanging out there still. The next thing was to get cherry pick from that hopeless branch that I couldn't rebase and had issues trying to sync. I needed to go out, find the commits, and make sure that just those commits contain the changes that I wanted, and then basically cherry pick those commits into my now synced local branch. So what I did, I went out to GitHub. I figured out what I needed to cherry pick. There were 2 commits that I needed to grab, and then went out and found a helpful blog post that walked me through some of this. Now, the article I really liked. It does caution to cherry pick as a last resort, as few times as possible, because there are opportunities for it to create duplicate commits. For instance, if you have a commit somewhere back in the main branch list of commits, the log, and if you try to attach those commits onto your feature branch, it can commit duplicates and things like that. But this is exactly what I wanted in this scenario. I went in and it does a git cherry pick commit hash, and it also provides a helpful flag that I ended up using, which is --no-commit. And this means that it's not going to add the commit to the commit log. It's just going to pull the changes into the working directory. I could pull in both commits, cherry pick those 2 commits that I needed, not actually add those to the commit log, just incorporate the changes into my working directory, and then create a unified commit that then I could push up without resetting or adding things to the commit log that I didn't want or didn't need. So I was able to combine all these changes into a nice clean format, create a single commit for incorporating this internal feedback that I had gotten, and really not mess anything up in this way. And I was able to go out and check all of this, make sure that those changes is exactly what got applied. And then I pushed that new branch back up to GitHub. And then I was able to actually compare when I did the PR request and make sure that only the changes that I had recently made were getting applied to that main branch. Then I also got into the weeds a little bit on finding out which remote branch is the source of truth. Because again, I'm dealing with a remote repository and several branches, and then my fork repository and several branches. And I really wanted to understand, why were these getting out of sync? Is there a better way that I can approach this? Because really, I want to pull in the official repository's changes and just keep my fork synced. I looked into this a little bit, and trying to find out which remote and branch is the source of truth can be a little bit tricky. But I found an article that states this really clearly, and it's git branch-vv. So that's verbose. It's going to explain everything and show everything. And it does give a little bit of a caveat and cautionary tale on that if you're trying to use that in scripting or something like that. But this was really, really helpful because it actually shows the remote repository and also the remote branch that it's tracking. And of course, you can change that with upstream tracking. You can change the tracking branch, and I have an article for that as well. That's hopefully helpful. And then once I got all this done and everything looked good and the PR is clean, then I could go back and clean up my local branches after the merge and delete the extra feature branches and messed up branches in GitHub, and then clean up my local rendition of all that too. The thing that I really like about the blog post that I used here is it lets you do a dry run of what's going to get pruned out, the branches that are going to get cleaned out and removed locally. It does a git remote prune, the remote repository name, and then --dry-run. It says, here's what we are going to remove, and then you can actually do the git remote prune command to actually remove those. But it lets you verify this and know exactly what's going to get removed before you actually remove it, which I find super helpful. After all of this was done, everything's clean, everything's synced back up. I hope to have a little bit of a discussion next week with some internal folks on how to best keep things in sync. Probably what I need to do is just every time I open that repository, just sync it with the upstream main branch, so the official repository's latest stuff, and then make my changes. But I do need to have that step in mind and make sure that I'm doing that before I get started on any of my changes. There may be a better way to do that. Maybe I'll have an update for you guys on what I end up deciding or end up getting recommended for doing that. The second thing is I came across a presentation by Guy Royce called Dungeons, Dragons, and Graph Databases. And someone had recommended this to me, a colleague of mine had recommended this to me, and it's a really fun intro approach to graph databases. It's about 4 years old now, I think, so it's a little bit older, but really fabulous introduction. It compares and helps you understand the differences between relational and graph in a kind of non-judgmental or attacking way. It's here's how you would do this in relational databases. Here's how you would do this in graph databases. Okay, let's take it to the next step. How would you do this in either of the two? And it walks you through a use case of what that looks like along the way. Very introductory, very conversational, and just really interesting. It also made it really, really fun because this was a fun data set that was near and dear to the speaker's heart. And so this just made it that much more entertaining and engaging because the speaker was having fun with it too. It also showed some differences in adding relationships later for relational versus graph, writing queries, focusing on path queries, or finding the most treasure or the most experience points through Dungeons and Dragons, how you might be able to do that with a map stored in a database. And then answering questions through the data is what the focus of this presentation really was. How can I answer this type of question or that type of question? And really showcasing what that looked like in either of the databases. Just when I start to feel like I'm getting the hang of it, I end up in a scenario like this week that leaves me lost and confused. Thankfully, there are tons of very helpful posts and walkthroughs as long as you know what to search for. I'm always looking for new and interesting ways to approach simpler or older topics like intro to graphs, and I really enjoyed Guy Royce's approach in his Dungeons and Dragons example. As always, thanks for listening and happy coding.